Okay, it's Tuesday, the 18th of November. Thrilled to be here with you on the regular Tuesday night video chat, as always. And let's leap right into the questions that have been sent in, because there are quite a few. Here's a woman who says, my daughter has a friend that she used to walk home with, and the friend's name was Lisa, and she now has a new friend named Trish. Well, moments ago, of course this wasn't written moments ago, but at the time that she wrote it, it was, moments ago Lisa's mother and Lisa, this is the old friend, remember, showed up on my doorstep. The mother told me that my daughter, Susan, and her friend, the new friend, Trish, were pulling her daughter Lisa's hair and poking her and taunting her all day at school. So here's the picture. The woman who's writing says that this old friend and the mother, they are standing there at the daughter saying that this woman's daughter is picking on her daughter at school along with the new friend. So Lisa also said, this is the old friend, that on Halloween someone called her from Susan, your daughter's phone, and was teasing her about a bad haircut. If this is true, this would be pretty terrible behavior, because bullying is no small matter, considered the most common and probably the most damaging form of violence, actually, in schools today. More questions revealed that my daughter Susan did not make the call, but did give out the private number, which she should not have done. Susan, my daughter, also did not pull the other girl's hair or poke her or taunt her, but she did stand by while her new friend, Trish, did those things. Lisa, the old friend, thought Susan should have demanded that Trish, the bullying girl, stop her behavior. I said that it was wrong of my daughter to give out the phone number, but they needed to talk to Trish and her parents about her behavior, and they left. And I agree. You can't, stop. It was, Trish's behavior is her responsibility. Your daughter, in standing by, was certainly a coward. That's a fact. But most people are in the face of a bully. Most people do not have the courage to stop a bully when a bully's picking on somebody else. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have the courage. I'm just saying it's a common condition. Then you continue. When the mother and daughter left, they ran into my daughter Susan and her friend Trish, because they were apparently about ready to get to the house, and began to talk to them. Of course, this just started it all over again. And they started, criticizing my daughter and her new friend. And then my husband joined the conversation, and he's a bit of a controller. And he looked at my daughter Susan in that authoritative, confrontational way and said, "We do not give out our friends' phone numbers to anyone." And I interrupted him at that point, because I told my husband a couple of years ago that we cannot humiliate, discipline, or cause fear in our children in front of their peers or even adults, because it will hurt them in the long run in so many ways. And that's true. The love that we give our children is the most important thing as we deal with them, and humiliating them is just devastating. You continue. My husband is now upset with me because he says that he's lost all credibility with Lisa's mother, and now he's not talking to me. And then her email went on. It was considerably longer than this, and she goes on to say that she was right to protect her child, but her husband says that he was right to correct the child there in front of the parent of the child who'd been bullied. And you could debate this forever. So who's right? Are you right for protecting your child from your husband's criticism, and really he was being a little harsh, or was your husband right to correct your child? Well, you're both right and you're both wrong. So your husband, was he right about the mistake that your child made? Yes, your child should not have given out the phone number of some other child to another child who would then misuse it. Where he made the mistake was in the way that he delivered it. It's not appropriate to correct our children in front of anybody else. Not in front of other kids, not in front of other adults, because as we do that, all we're going to do is make them look foolish. And the only kind of correction that our children are going to ever receive is the teaching that we give them while we help them to feel unconditionally loved. And they're not going to feel loved while we humiliate them in front of others. So your husband was right in what he told her, and he was completely wrong in the way that he did it. Now, let's get to you. Were you right then about saying that your husband was incorrect to do that in front of other people? Yes, we just covered that. But you were also wrong, because you did to your husband exactly what he did to your daughter. I mean, the same thing. Identical. He corrected her in front of other people. And then what did you do? You told him that he shouldn't do that. Well, you corrected him in front of other people. What's the difference? There isn't any. Nobody receives correction well when they're being humiliated in front of others. So the wisest course of action then would have been to do this. You pretty much almost always have to let people make their mistakes when they're making them in front of others. So like when your husband was making this mistake in front of these other people, you just have to let him make the mistake. Short of, raising a knife to stab somebody, then you pretty much going to have to do something. But you're just going to have to let him make the mistake. Now, it may be that as he's talking, you might be able to quietly, kind of surreptitiously, secretly, clandestinely, sneakily, reach out with your hand and gently touch his elbow in a way to let him know that you're loving him, supporting him in a way that would, maybe quiet the situation a little bit. But not to stop him, not to grip his elbow, not to shake him to let him know, ooh, stop that. That's not going to work. You have to let people make their mistakes. Then you can talk to him about it later. In fact, it can be very helpful for you to point out to him that you made the primary decision, which is that your husband is always the most important. You can say, it is in fact evidence of my love for you that I did nothing while you were saying this to our daughter and making her feel terrible in front of these people. I support you first. But you need to know that you are correcting her in front of these people has a really terrible effect on her. And so I just want you to know that. Now, if you say to him, don't ever do that again, he's not going to hear what you're saying. But what you can say is that you just need to know that when you do that, it has a terrible effect on her. She feels terrible about it for days afterward, and then she doesn't want to listen to anything you say. And so you just need to know that as you make that kind of decision in the future. And I would hope that you and I could agree that it would be better not to do that. That would be a way to approach it. But stopping him in the middle of it, not helpful. Then you could talk to Susan, to your daughter, and say that you understand that she felt humiliated, and tell her that you love her. That would be helpful. And then everybody wins. But stopping them in the middle, people really hate to be corrected while they're making mistakes. Here's somebody who wrote and said, a friend of mine and I were talking, and I asked her, how do you deal with the long laundry list of failures on both sides of a relationship? It becomes oppressive. My partner and I get to the place where we just accuse each other all the time and attack each other and feel bitter. And then I get low and mean. I haven't heard that expression for a while, though I've heard it before. It's you get the picture of a cat almost crouching low and approaching its prey, low and mean. And the list shows up, and it all becomes evidence of the ultimate failure of the relationship. I stop caring and embrace the inevitable failure. It's like boo-hoo, nothing is ever going to work and no one is ever going to love me and so on. I've heard you suggest to people to not talk for 30 days or to call somebody and say that you're turning into a junkyard dog right in front of your own eyes. Well, you've described the possibilities really pretty well. Don't speak when you're empty and afraid. Never. Now, you leapt immediately to not talking for 30 days. Stick with just the don't speak when you're empty and afraid. Try following that rule, for example. Set that rule for yourself for an entire day. Just for a day. Promise yourself that you will never speak while you're empty and afraid all day long. See how that works. If you can do that for a whole day, try it for a week. If you get to the place where it's pretty obvious that you just can't stop yourself, if you can't even go all day long without speaking while you're empty and afraid, if you just keep lashing out in anger, and if you just keep thinking about all the screw-ups in your relationship and you keep speaking out in bitterness, if it gets to the place where you and your partner, or you or your partner, either one of you, are speaking with recriminations, with guilt, with vengeance, with anger, with irritation, then, kind of a rule that I often use when I'm speaking to couples is no more wounds. Once we've wounded each other enough times, we just don't need any more. When we're bleeding half to death, sometimes all it takes is just a touch to open 5 more wounds, and we just don't need any more wounds. And so if you're getting to where you can't open your mouth without opening another wound, then you may need to try 7 days, or initially 7, and if that's not enough, then you may need to try 30 days of no speaking at all. If you can't do the no speaking without speaking in anger, then you're going to have to go to no speaking at all. If you can't control the anger, then at least you can do the no speaking at all. And the purpose of that is not to withdraw from each other. The purpose is not to run. The purpose is not to allow time to heal wounds. Now, that old phrase, time will heal all wounds, isn't true. It's to allow yourself 30 days, 1, to quit hurting each other, and 2, to practice, both of you if possible, to practice being with people who can then unconditionally love you, so that these wounds that you keep inflicting on each other can heal. And so that you can get enough unconditional love so that at the end of this 7 days, 15 days, 30 days, at the end of this period of time, you can go to each other and now practice speaking without wounding. So that maybe at the end of that time you can then try the book 40 Days, the new 40-day companion to the Real Love book, so that you can now practice using loving language with each other. Some of us just need that period of separation so that we can get recharged and healed. Here's somebody who says, are all children who arrogantly insist that parents give in to their demands, like smoking pot, staying out past a curfew, give them the keys to a car, and so on, are they all really wanting real love? Isn't it possible that some people, especially teens, prefer the praise, power, pleasure, or safety that easily and quickly come with imitation love, given that real love requires too much requires too much, that telling the truth about one's, like telling the truth about one's own mistakes. Isn't it easier and more preferable for immature kids, or don't many immature kids and many adults prefer to be selfish rather than loving? Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Imitation love actually is what most people want. That's why they're out there swimming in it. That's why they're out there trading in it. That's why the world virtually runs on a commerce of trading imitation love. Imitation love is what people want because it's easily producible, it's easy to get, it's everywhere, it's easily traded, it's quantifiable, we're familiar with it. But it's the entire point of parenting, and eventually we'll get to the subject of it's the entire point of life, is not to give children what they want, it's to give them what they need. That's the whole point of the parenting. Children will constantly demand what they want, but what they want isn't good for them. Just as a cocaine addict will tell you what he wants, which is another hit of cocaine. Well, if you love him, you don't give him what he wants. You give him what he needs. And the same is true with children. And this is probably the biggest failure of parents, is that they're constantly listening to children tell them what they want. And in order not to lose their children's love, they actually give their children what they want. It's crazy making. I watch parents who, when their children say, "I want a candy bar," the parents actually think that they're somehow obligated to give that to them. In most cases, it's utterly irrelevant what a child says that they want, because the child hasn't the slightest clue what they need. So we're supposed to be the adults here. And so we need to decide, what does the child need? Because what will the child say? "I want to stay up all night." Well, so is that what we're going to give them? Well, no. And the same is true in relationships as adults. We have to decide what is the thing that is needed, not what is wanted. So you're absolutely right. And it takes a lot of guts for parents to tell children what they need. Here's somebody who says, "I'm starting to improve my relationship with my daughter now that she's in college. My wife has decided to leave me and is waiting for the youngest child to hit college." I guess he means before she leaves me. "I'm unable to get my daughter to tell me how she feels about this." I assume how she feels about my wife leaving. "In some ways," yes, because then he says, "in some ways she may be blaming me for my wife's decision." So listen to what you're saying. You're saying, "I'm unable to get my daughter to tell me how she feels about this." Children don't really like it when we try to get something from them, especially feelings, love, attention, so on. So instead of doing that, reframe this and concentrate on what you give to her. I mean, here she's watching her parents' marriage break up. She's watching your wife behave in an unloving way toward you, and I'm sure she's seeing you behave in unloving ways toward her. And here you are coming and trying to get her to express her feelings. So instead of that, tell her how you have failed her as a father by not being unconditionally loving. You be the adult and provide her with information that she would not be able to express. So here you're worried that she might blame you for being the unconditionally loving parent. Well, take the doubt out of it. Tell her how you have not been unconditionally loving. Tell her that in many respects you are to blame. Say, "Here's how I have failed to be unconditionally loving as a husband. Here's how I have failed to be unconditionally loving as a father." Tell her why. "I was ill-prepared from the time I was a child. I never learned anything about unconditional love. Now, let me tell you what I've learned about unconditional love. And then tell her that you plan on doing a better job. You may not be able to heal your marriage. That's not entirely up to you. But tell her that you plan on doing a better job of loving your wife, whether she stays with you or leaves you. Either way. But the big thing your daughter wants to hear is whether you're going to love her. Children are injured not nearly as much by divorce as they are by the lack of real love that led to the divorce. And what she wants to know is, what are you going to do about seeing to it that she feels unconditionally loved, whether there's a divorce or not? So explain that to her. Read Real Love in Parenting. Learn a ton about what it's going to mean to unconditionally love your daughter. Read the section about divorce in Real Love in Parenting. Read the section about divorce in Real Love in Marriage. Learn how to explain unconditional love to your daughter. That's what she needs, rather than you trying to get her to explain her feelings to you. Eventually, as you're more open and honest with her about you, eventually she will tell you how she feels. But don't push her. That won't help. Here's a letter from a woman who shared a letter that she wrote to her husband. There really wasn't a question associated with this, so I'm going to kind of just make comments on her letter as we go. And I don't have the benefit of the letter that her husband wrote to her. And this is a response that she wrote to her husband, so we're going to do the best we can. So she's writing to her husband, and she says this to him: "It's no longer about being right or wrong or whose fault it is." Well, that's a good start, because it really doesn't matter whose fault it is. It matters what we're going to do now. Although, I got to tell you, sweetie, that it is very helpful as you're talking to your partner to do a whole lot of saying, "It's my fault." So when you say it doesn't really matter whose fault it is, that's only kind of partly true. It's just really helpful not to point out that it's his fault. But it is really helpful to point out how we've made mistakes when we're talking to our partner. So let's continue. You say, "What I've learned and what I'm learning to still do is to tell the truth about how I'm feeling, regardless of how I may think the other person, parenthesis, my husband, will respond. If I have communicated in the most loving way I know how, it's okay to be me. How it is received or taken is your responsibility and not mine. I am still learning this." You have to be a little careful when you say to somebody, "I'm going to tell you how I feel, and how you take it is not my responsibility." That's true. That's something that I can write in a book and tell people generically. But when you tell your partner this, I can tell you it comes across usually pretty cold. Just from oodles of experience of watching people do this, when you say to your partner, "I'm going to tell you how I feel, and it's not my responsibility how you take it," almost invariably our partners take that as just a little bit of up yours. I'm going to tell you how I feel, and if that hurts your feelings, tough. That's kind of how that tends to come across. So I'm just telling you, be a little careful when you use phrases like that. And it's important that you not get caught up in just telling the truth about, because what you say here is that I'm learning to tell the truth about how I'm feeling. So be careful about not just telling the truth about how you feel, because this is scary stuff. Because people often say, "Yes, I tell the truth about myself." Then I say, "Give me an example." And they say, "Well, now I'm getting really good at saying, for example, when I get angry, I am angry. I feel hurt." Well, that's really not so much telling the truth about you, because you know what the rest of that sentence is? I feel angry when you, and I feel hurt when you. And so when we tell the truth about our feelings, and especially when we tell the truth about our feelings to the person that those feelings are associated with, they feel blamed. So if I'm talking to my partner and I say, yesterday when you said that, I felt angry. And yesterday when you did this, I felt hurt. And yesterday when you did this, I felt... It sounds like I'm telling the truth about me, but wow. About 90% of that to my partner sounds like I'm blaming them. It really does. So we need to be careful as we're telling the truth about ourselves to mostly talk about the choices we make. We need to frame it in terms of how we were. So you might say, yesterday when you did this, instead of listening to you and instead of being compassionate, instead of being understanding, I chose to attack you. See how different that is from yesterday when you did this. I was angry. I was hurt. Those are feelings as opposed to choices. So there's a caution in this telling the truth about feelings things. Feelings are more passive, whereas telling the truth about our choices, that's more active, and our choices are more who we are than our feelings are. You continue. I was wrong for not telling you the truth when you asked me Saturday morning what was wrong. And I know how these go. Our partners say to us, so is there something wrong? And then we go, no. It's because we're afraid of getting into an argument or whatever. And then you continue. Yes, I was afraid of how you would react toward me in front of the kids. I'm still learning not to go to that safety place. Okay, just because the kids are there doesn't mean you can't respond. And so this is what we have to learn to do is to take the kids out of the equation. You don't want to feel afraid. Feeling afraid is death. Fear is a killer. You feel afraid, your life comes to an end. So what you can do is you can tell him that something is wrong, but not in front of the kids. You can say, yes, I would like to talk to you. Can you come with me for a second? And you can go into the other room. You can go outside. You can go upstairs. You can take a bus. Anything. But don't do it in front of the kids. People say, well, I couldn't say anything. The kids were there. Yeah, you could have said something. Go somewhere else. You continue. The truth is that you let me and the kids down, and my emotions were hurt and left feeling empty, which is my issue. Now, that part, you're getting there. It's true. It was your choice. But the kids and I were looking forward to a movie night with Daddy. I know that you had other things you were handling, but what I'm learning is that when you commit to something, to your wife, the most important person in your life, adding that little thing in your letter to him comes across as an accusation, I can tell you. It's true that you should be the most important person in your life, which I could tell him without having emotion behind it. I could say to your husband, Fred, Sweetie is the most important person in your life, and you need to pay more attention to that. I can say that. But if you say, when you make a commitment to me, the most important person in your life, it will come across as an accusation, as blaming. It will. You say that when you make a commitment to the most important person in your life and to your children, you keep that promise. Well, see, that's technically true. But when you just put it in writing and you deliver this in a letter to your husband, it will come across like a bullet. And his feelings will be hurt. They will be. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to him about not keeping a promise. But what you do is you take him aside. Don't put it in writing. Don't do it. Writing is the worst way to talk to somebody about their faults, because if you put something in writing, what people do is they hear it in the most accusatory voice that they can think of in their lives, usually the voice of a parent, their most accusatory parent. You can take him aside and you can say, last night we'd agreed to go on a movie night, and when that didn't happen, that was something we'd really agreed to do. And when that doesn't happen, then after a while, I get to the place where I begin to wonder if you're going to do the things you say you're going to do. And so do the children. Now, do you see how different that is? I begin to wonder whether you're going to do the things you say you're going to do. No matter what your reason is. I realize you have other things to do. But I begin to wonder if you're going to keep your commitment. See how different that is from my feelings are hurt because you haven't kept your commitment to the most important person in the world. Much less accusatory. And then you go on and talk about the commitment a little bit more. And then you talk about another issue that is an important one. And that is the fact that he's been using marijuana, which is a problem. You're talking about that you tried to talk to him and that he's been so high that you can hardly speak to him, that you don't want it smoked in your house. I'm choosing not to be around you when you smoke. That's my choice. I'm learning it's okay to have my choices, that you can hardly speak to him, makes you sick to your stomach. This is a real problem. You do need to talk to him about this issue because drugs are absolutely crippling. But rather than go to him and say, I'm going to set boundaries, my feelings are hurt, what you need to do is talk to him about the effect that it's having. You need to say to him, the most important relationship in my life is you. And the most important thing in your life is to be happy. See how much sense this is making? And you need to have this conversation with him when he's not stoned. The most important thing in your life is to be happy. And when you're happy, you're able to contribute to the happiness of this relationship, which is the most important thing to me, and to the relationship with your children, and you need to say to him, are your children important to you? Ask him. And then ask him, how important are they to you? Because then when he says, they're very important to me. So then I need to ask you, are your children as important to you as the drugs you smoke? Yes or no? Because I need to tell you this, because this is not a discussion, this part. When you're smoking, you don't know how impaired you are. You don't. People who smoke do not. And especially people who smoke marijuana, this is a real favorite trick of marijuana smokers. Believe me, I've talked to hundreds of them. And marijuana smokers will say, it's no different than smoking alcohol and blah, 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 blah. But it comes down to this. Whether you're smoking marijuana or alcohol, whatever. When we're using drugs, and I can speak from considerable experience having been a drug addict for many years, but in this case we'll just talk about marijuana. The problem with smoking marijuana is not whether it's physically addictive and whether you can come up with 20 different reasons or excuses to use it. The problem is that when you're smoking, it does affect your thinking. It's hard enough to have loving relationships with people under the best conditions, under pristine conditions. It's hard enough. And when you add marijuana to the mix, I can tell you that it can become pretty much impossible in a second. People do not think as well. They do not love as well. And I can tell you that most people absolutely become incapacitated, utterly incapable of feeling unconditional love while they're under the influence of any drug. Alcohol, marijuana, narcotics, in many cases, Benadryl. It affects our souls. And so for that reason, you just need to say to him, when you're smoking, and for a long time afterward, it essentially destroys our ability to have a relationship and destroys your ability to be a husband and father. Are you willing to live with those consequences? You need to point that out to him every single time he smokes and love him. And if loving him and pointing that out to him, and you have to be willing to point it out to him even if he's mad. The problem with people who do this kind of thing is that if they get mad, they think we'll go away. And so then they get to make a poor choice and not suffer the consequences. So we have to be willing to have the guts to point out to them what they're doing, so that at least when they make the bad choice, they get to live with the consequences too, which is hearing about their bad choice, at the very least. So, you love him, but you still point out his behavior. If that doesn't work consistently, he's already made the choice by continuing to use drugs to separate himself from you. And in many cases, what I recommend to partners is that they may have to separate themselves from their partners. Because what you have to do in the cases where people continue to make bad choices is to increase the consequences where they feel the pain. And say to them, well then, the children and I may have to separate ourselves from you until you appreciate the seriousness of what you're doing. Oh, you wouldn't leave me over this. Yeah, actually I would. So the children and I will be moving away for a period of 2 weeks until you can get yourself completely clean. And when we come back, we'll be doing regular, random, and witnessed drug urine screens on you to be sure that you stay clean. It's not a small thing for people to use drugs in a marriage. It really isn't. It makes love impossible. I'll talk more about that in the future if you want to. Here's somebody who writes, after years of hearing from my spouse, this was a mistake, I'm done, I want a divorce. This is a pretty favorite weapon for some spouses in marriages. We should end this. If you don't do blank, then you can just find another place to live. It's been about 8 months since I've heard something like this, but I still feel the wounds of it. I feel like I've become hardened toward my spouse in the respect of not feeling safe to opening up and telling my truths. I'm more comfortable telling others, but I know that I need to share them with my spouse so I can create a new feeling in our marriage. But I'm still in fear of sharing. We're only afraid to tell the truth about our mistakes because of risk. And risk of what? Risk of not feeling loved. And in your case, gosh, the risk is pretty much over, isn't it? I mean, you've already heard the worst. I'm going to leave you. I'm going to divorce you. Move out. I'm going to... What more risk is there? So you've already lived in hell, or the threat of hell, constantly. She, in fact, I can't tell from this whether it's a he or she, actually. He or she's already threatening to leave, or has threatened to leave, on many occasions. So how could you make it any worse by telling her anything? So your relationship can really only go up. I mean, you're living in a closed-off state where you're afraid to talk to your partner about who you are. At this point, your fear is keeping you in prison more than anything else. You've got absolutely nothing to lose. And you need to see that. In many cases, it helps people to see that, to see what the worst possible case could be. If you were to tell the truth about yourself, just completely openly and honestly now with your spouse, what's the worst possible scenario? Your spouse could leave. Well, the condition in which you live now, your spouse has already left. Both you and your spouse have already left each other emotionally. You already live in a dead relationship. So how could you lose? You can only go up. And this can only happen if you tell the truth. So what you've got now is nothing. Gosh, why don't you create the possibility of a win here? So tell the truth. Take the responsibility for all your mistakes. Lay it all out. And there might be some hard times, but couldn't be much worse than you have now. And then, after a while, if you hear any of those threats again, like, this was a mistake, I'm done, I want a divorce, be loving for a while, but after a while, you can only hear that so many times. And then you just eventually have to say to a partner, people only threaten divorce to gain some measure of control as a thing of power. And they only keep doing it if it works. I knew a man that I talked to recently, and his wife used to do this with him. And she'd say, well, I think I'll just get a divorce. And she'd do that because whenever he would bring up a difficult subject and she would bring up divorce, then he'd stop talking to her. And so he'd stop talking about whatever subject was difficult. He'd stop, and then she, of course, inwardly would be going, well, that worked. And so she'd bring up the big D-bomb every time he'd bring up something difficult, and so, of course, she'd use the D-bomb the next time. And so what I told him was, the next time she does that, you have to take away the reward for the D-bomb. You have to keep talking. And so you have to say to her something like, well, you can keep talking about divorce if you want to, but that's up to you. But you have a choice here to make. I'm choosing to keep doing whatever it takes to be happy. And so I'm going to keep telling the truth about myself, and I'm going to keep taking the steps individually to find love and happiness in my life. And because I'm not satisfied with living as a roommate with you, I'm going to keep taking the steps with you to find happiness. So I'm also going to keep telling the truth about myself and keep involving myself in conversations with you. And you can keep threatening divorce if you want to, but now I have a question for you. Because, see, she's always thrown the D-bomb out at him and then expected the conversation to stop. And it always has. And so I suggested to him, instead of letting it stop, throw the ball back in her court. Or, if you want to use the metaphor, take the grenade while the pin is still out and throw it back in her side. And say, so, what do you want in life? Do you want to keep threatening divorce? And in all this time that you've done that, has it ever made you happy? Ask her. And wait for an answer, instead of just the usual letting the divorce word bring the conversation to an end. Has it ever made you happy? Of course, she's going to have to say no. And when she says no, then say, so would you like to do something different? Because, after a while, this divorce threat's kind of boring. And it's okay to say that. It's boring. And once you tell somebody who keeps throwing that word out to bring the conversation to an end that it's just kind of boring and that you'd like to do something different, she's going to quit throwing it out because it doesn't get the same response. And so then you say to her, so if you'd like to be happy, let's try something different. Now, if you have a better plan to make our marriage happy, I'm just itching to hear it. But if you don't, let's try this, what we're doing. So let me know if you do. But talking about divorce, that isn't going to work. So it's either let's try this or actually get one. Get a divorce. But talking about it, no yield there. And that pretty much brings an end to these threats of divorce. While excuse me. While enacting the law of choice with my girlfriend, her choices eventually become irresponsible and deceiving by living a parallel life with her ex-husband and lying to me to cover it up. My question is, do I tolerate this behavior, or do I enact choices of my own by leaving the relationship? Simple. You just talked about the law of choice. You give her a choice. You say, you have a choice. You can either choose to live a monogamous relationship with me, in which the two of us develop a mutually loving, unconditionally loving relationship, or you can choose to go back with your ex-husband. Your choice entirely, what you want to do. If you choose to piddle around in the middle, where you're half with me and half with your ex-husband, then I will make my choice, which will be to leave you entirely, because that would be an insufficient relationship. for me. And just tell her that. And you don't get to piddle around even a little bit. So if you get to do whatever you want, I'm not trying to influence what you do, because by the law of choice, that's your pick. But if you have any more contact, and you defined what any more contact looks like, but if you have any more contact, this would be what I would do. If you have any more contact with your ex-husband, because see, he's now an ex-husband. Ex-husbands qualify right up there with the mailman. They're nobody after you're exed. If you choose to have any more contact with your ex-husband, especially the way you're describing it here, a parallel life, unless it's to transfer children, but I'm not hearing any mention here of children, then I'll just simply choose to leave the relationship. There's no reason for you to be sharing her with an ex-husband. Kind of ridiculous, unless you choose that's satisfactory to you. Here's somebody who says we're working through the Real Love and Marriage workbook, and since we started, we've been in it a few days. We've been attacking each other more, or at least it feels like attacking. I feel less love and less loving, and I've also noticed that I drop into victim. I would like to be able to hear my partner without feeling hurt by what he says. It would be nice, you would have the somewhat reasonable expectation, I would think, that in starting the 40 days workbook, that it would just suddenly propel you into an increased life of unconditional love in your relationship, wouldn't you? But actually, in the beginning, it's not at all uncommon for working together in the workbook to actually increase the conflict in your marriage. And the reason for that's pretty obvious, actually. Many people have managed to survive in their relationship simply by running, simply by not having contact, simply by not discussing issues at all. I counseled with a couple once who'd been married for over 50 years. And so I asked him, so how's your relationship? And he said, oh, it's fine. Everything's just great. And I asked her how her relationship, how her marriage was. And she said it was awful. She was ready to get divorced. And they were sitting together. They simply never spoke. And that's a pretty common thing. People just kind of coexist. They get along. And they get along by not talking about difficult things. So if you want to increase the unconditional love in your relationship, that involves actually telling the truth about yourself. That involves actually speaking to each other. And in the beginning, my gosh, that's going to increase the opportunity for unconditional love, to be sure, but it's also going to increase the opportunity for expectations, which increases the opportunity for disappointment and anger and conflict. So you're going to have some of that. That's pretty understandable. It opens old wounds. And it opens old wounds at a place where understanding doesn't yet match our ability to love, or doesn't yet match our understanding, and our love doesn't yet match our truth-telling abilities. So, that's where the conflict comes in. So my suggestion is relax, lighten up, keep going. When you get to a place where you get into conflict, you say, why don't we come back to this tomorrow? Why don't we do a little bit more reading? Why don't we take a break and maybe call some wise people? But don't look at it as something that's entirely unexpected. You're not alone. Here's a letter that I got from a Real Love coach. In the past year, I've coached several different women through various stages of dysfunctional, unloving relationships, divorcees, and I love that word, divorcees, so French, and ex-girlfriends. All of these women have a good working understanding of real love, attended seminars, read materials, and seem to comprehend and agree with the phrase that you've used many times when dealing with ex-boyfriends, ex-husbands. The phrase being, what part of X don't you understand? Yet, these women continue to engage whenever their ex is called to blast them about how they are rotten mothers, ex-wives, girlfriends, human beings, and these women continue to take these abusive, whining, angry phone calls, texting and responding to their text messages, breaking off communications only to resume them and thus begin their downward spiral anew. Then they complain about how they're being treated, and I've seen this myself over and over again. I listen to people talk all the time, and conversations begin with me where people, both women and men, but more often women, and women will tell me how they just had yet another angry 2-hour conversation with their ex, and I'm thinking, you're kidding me. Why would you ever have an angry conversation with an ex that went for longer than 20 seconds? What was wrong with the hang-up part of your hand for the phone? Could it be, he continues, that these women and others are deeply addicted to their need for an ex's approval, even when they're literally surrounded by scores of people who unconditionally love them? Why do exes have such a hold? Our ex-partners know more about our flaws than anybody else does. So they have the ability to annoy us more than anybody else does. And because they know more about our flaws, we have a profound need to avoid their disapproval. So when an ex calls and says, you are this and this and this and this, more than with anybody else, we have a need to prove to them that we're not this and this and this and this. Other people cannot reach in there and get us by the throat like our exes can. It's like we have to reach back into the past and prove with our exes that we are not the terrible, horrible, awful monsters that our exes think that we are, as opposed to just letting it go. We can't look at our exes and realize that the only reason that our exes are saying that we are all these horrible things is only, almost entirely, because our exes are not getting what they want. We don't have to listen to a single word that they say. Second, we invested more in them. If you spend $1 on something and it proves to be defective, and somebody says to you, well, what do you think about that thing? You won't hesitate to describe its faults. If you spend $1 on a toy and it's defective and they ask you, you say, oh, it was a piece of garbage. And you'll toss it. If you spend $100,000 on something, and they've done studies on this, like a car, and it turns out to have some defects, and somebody says, how do you like your car? The people who spend $100,000 on a car will brag on that car even if it has flaws. Why? Because they've invested who they are in it, and it becomes part of them. And so, see, we invested so much in our exes that they become part of us, and we just can't quite let them go. Well, we got to let it go. I talked to a lady just the other night who's been having the same discussion with her ex about her kids and having the same miserable, angry, disapproving discussions for 8 years. She'd talk to him for an hour or two at a time. And I said, what is wrong with you? And she can hardly even explain herself. And I said, so this gets really simple. If he's calling, she said, well, but he calls and he tells me about the children. Who cares what he tells you? Don't you already know his opinion? Well, yeah, but there's no but. If he calls you to tell you that the child is in jail, then you say, thank you, now I know. If he calls you to tell you that there's a child who's spurting arterial blood, say, thank you, now I know. Is there somebody there to put something around the kid's arm? Otherwise, I'll be right over. In short, if an ex calls to give you pertinent, relevant, critical information, then you take it down, which should take you all of, 30 seconds, and you're done. But as I said to this woman, the instant an ex tells you, I think, I believe, you should, as soon as they tell you their opinion, what do you care? Don't you already know their opinions on pretty much every subject on the planet? Well, didn't you divorce them because of those opinions? So why do you want to hear them again? And like I told her, the instant he says, I think, you immediately say, oh, I already know what you think. Do you have any new information to give me? Well, but you said, no, any new information. If not, goodbye. And you hang up. Now the conversations take 60 seconds instead of 60 minutes. What a delightful savings in time, huh? We really get too much involved in stuff. We get too much involved in the drama. A mother called me the other night and said that her son, for example, who was 9, demanded that he have ice cream before he go to bed. Her son was a little overweight, her son's a little demanding, and she said no. And so he pulled a knife from the drawer and held it to his chest and said he was going to kill himself. He's 9. And so what did she do? She had a long, dramatic conversation with him about calling 911 and about how it would be terrible to kill himself and about how he'd have to be admitted to the hospital and blah, 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 blah. I mean, she turned it into an episode of Days of Our Lives. Well, now, the next time that he wants ice cream from the fridge, he got so much attention from this, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to pull a knife from the drawer and hold it to his chest and say, I'm going to kill myself. Because he sucked her onto the field of death with him. Now, she could have done worse, it's true. But he said, I wanted ice cream. And she said, no. So what do? You just look over and go, oh, well, if you kill yourself, then you won't get any ice cream at all, will you? Not today, not tomorrow, not next week. And you go right back to whatever you're doing. You don't get on the field of death with people. When people act like victims, that's why they're doing it, is so you will climb onto the field of death with them, get all excited, and boy, then they've got you, not just then, they've got you for the rest of their lives. So we need to love people, but we also need to teach them and hold them responsible so that their behavior so they can be accountable for their behavior, so that they can be wiser, so that they can learn to be accountable and responsible and learn to be happy for the rest of their lives. So, been fun questions, wonderful questions. I look forward to getting your questions for next week. Send them to me at greg@reallove.com. Just thought I'd let you know that we're just about done with, we commissioned the Real Love book to be translated into Spanish, and the translation is almost complete. We should be putting that up on the website soon, the translation in Spanish, for pre-orders. And so we're letting you know about that. So we're excited about that being in yet another language. We've got it in Chinese and now Spanish. And so we'll be seeing you next week. And in the meantime, remember that it's always about real love. See you next Tuesday.